The road stretched ahead of me, long and empty, flanked on both sides by towering trees that swayed in the evening breeze. Their thick branches arched over the cracked asphalt, casting long, jagged shadows in the fading light. I'd been driving for hours, and my eyes were beginning to sting from the monotony, but something kept me on edge, a subtle pressure building in my chest, like I'd crossed an invisible line without even knowing it. When I saw the sign, I almost missed it. It sat crooked at the side of the road, half hidden by creeping vines. I slowed down, squinting at the peeling paint as I rolled past. Welcome to Blackburn Hollow. Population, 814. Below that, someone had scrawled a second message in red, uneven letters that looked more like warnings than words. I leaned closer, reading them aloud. Follow the rules. Stay safe. Don't ask questions. Charming, I thought, easing my foot off the gas and pulling to the side of the road. I stared at the sign for a moment, drumming my fingers on the steering wheel. I was used to small towns, but this was different. This wasn't the usual God bless our community, or drive carefully, kind of welcome. This felt wrong. Shaking my head, I put the car in gear and drove on. I hadn't transferred here for the scenery. I was here because my life in Little Rock had gone up in flames, and this backwater town, with its crooked welcome sign and creepy slogans, was the only place willing to give me a second chance. A few miles later, the trees thinned, and the town came into view. Blackburn Hollow wasn't much to look at. The main street was lined with old brick buildings that leaned toward each other like they were sharing secrets. A single gas station sat at the corner, its rusted pumps covered in peeling stickers. Across the street, a diner with flickering neon lights promised hot coffee and homemade pie, though judging by the empty parking lot, it didn't seem like anyone was taking them up on the offer. There were no cars, no people, just the low hum of the wind and the distant rustle of leaves. I pulled up in front of the police station, a squat, gray building with narrow windows that reminded me of a bunker. As I stepped out of the car, gravel crunched under my boots, and I glanced around again, expecting to see someone, anyone, watching me. But the street was still empty. Inside, the air smelled like old coffee and stale cigarettes. A faded American flag hung crooked on the wall, and a row of mismatched chairs lined the waiting area. Behind the front desk sat a man who looked like he'd been carved out of stone. Broad shoulders, close-cropped gray hair, and eyes that didn't miss a thing. Sheriff Crowley, I assume, I said, walking over and extending my hand. He didn't shake it. Luke Harrison, he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel sliding under a shovel. You're late. I blinked. Didn't know I was on a clock. His lips twitched, but it wasn't quite a smile. You are now. There was something about the way he said it that made my skin prickle, but before I could respond, he reached under the desk and pulled out a thin, leather-bound book. He slid it across the counter toward me. What's this? I asked, flipping it open. Rule book, he said. Read it. Learn it. Lie by it. I glanced down at the pages. They were yellowed with age, and the handwriting was cramped and uneven, like whoever had written it had been in a hurry, or scared. The first rule caught my eye right away. 1. Never be outside after dark. Is this a joke? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Do I look like I'm joking? I looked at him again. He didn't blink. Right. I muttered, closing the book and tucking it under my arm. Anything else I should know? Plenty, he said, standing up and grabbing his hat from the desk. He walked around to the front, his boots echoing off the floor. But you'll figure out soon enough. We stepped outside, and the sun was just starting to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Sheriff Crowley glanced at his watch, then at the darkening street. You should get home, he said. It's barely dusk. His eyes hardened. Get home, Officer Harrison, and lock your doors. Before I could ask why, he turned and walked off, his shadow stretching long across the pavement. I stood there for a moment, staring after him, then shook my head and got back in my car. I'd been in town less than an hour, and I already had more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. Blackburn Hollow wasn't like any place I'd ever been before, and something told me it was just getting started. The first thing I noticed about Blackburn Hollow wasn't the silence, though that was strange enough. It was the way people looked at me. Or, more accurately, the way they avoided looking at me. My first official day on a job started with a walk through Main Street. It wasn't a long walk. The entire street couldn't have stretched more than a couple hundred yards. There was a diner with faded red awnings, a general store with dusty windows, and a post office that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1960s. A few people lingered outside, but as soon as they spotted me, they shuffled away, heads down, like they wanted to disappear. I chalked it up to small-town unease around outsiders. People probably weren't used to seeing a new face around here, much less a cop from a bigger city. Still, it felt off. The police station was an old, squat building at the end of the street. It looked more like a hunting lodge than a law enforcement office, with dark wooden siding and a crooked chimney. When I walked inside, the first thing that hit me was the smell, a strange mix of stale coffee, damp wood, and something faintly metallic. "Morning," I said, stepping up to the front desk where a young deputy was flipping through paperwork. He looked up, startled, like I just caught him doing something he wasn't supposed to. "Oh, hi. You must be Officer Harrison. Sheriff told us you'd be starting today." "That's right," I said, holding out my hand. He shook it reluctantly, his grip weak and clammy. "I'm Deputy Grant," he said. "Welcome to Blackburn Hollow." "Thanks," I replied, glancing around the small station. There were only 2 desks, a couple of filing cabinets, and a corkboard covered in faded wanted posters and public notices. It wasn't exactly bustling with activity. "Quiet town, huh?" Grant gave a nervous laugh. "Yeah, you could say that." He didn't elaborate, and an awkward silence settled between us. Just then, the door to the sheriff's office swung open, and Marcello Crowley stepped out. He looked the same as he had the day before, tall, lean, and dressed in a perfectly pressed uniform that somehow made him look more dangerous than professional. "Luke," he said, nodding at me. "Come on in." I followed him into his office, where he gestured for me to sit in a worn leather chair across from his desk. He leaned back in his own chair, studying me with those cold, unreadable eyes. "How are you settling in?" he asked. "Fine," I said. "It's quiet." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That's how we like it." I shifted in my seat. "About these rules." His smile faded. "What about them?" "I mean, they're a little unusual, don't you think? The sign at the town limits, the whole never be outside after dark thing. What's that all about?" Marcello's expression hardened. "They're not suggestions, Officer Harrison. They're rules, and they're not meant to be broken." His tone left no room for argument, but something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. "I understand," I said slowly. "But what happens if someone breaks them?" For a moment, Marcello didn't answer. He just stared at me, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest of his chair. Then, finally, he said, "They face the consequences." Before I could ask what that meant, the radio on his desk crackled to life. A woman's voice came through, high-pitched and frantic. "Sheriff, we've got a situation at 214 Maple Street. It's Mr. Abernathy. He's dead." Marcello grabbed the radio. "We're on our way," he said, then stood and grabbed his hat. "Let's go," he told me. I followed him out of the office, my heart pounding. My first day on the job, and we already had a dead body. Maple Street was only a few blocks away. When we arrived, a small crowd had gathered outside a run-down, 2-story house with peeling paint and sagging gutters. The front door was wide open, and a woman was sobbing on the porch. Marcello pushed through the crowd, and I followed close behind. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something sour and metallic. We found Mr. Abernathy in the living room, slumped in an armchair. His eyes were wide open, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. His skin was pale and waxy, and there were deep, dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in weeks. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no obvious cause of death. But something about the way he looked, it wasn't natural. Marcello crouched down beside the body, his face expressionless. "He broke the rules," he said quietly. "What?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcello stood up and turned to face me. "He forgot to put out the milk." For a moment, I thought he was joking, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't. I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. "You're telling me he died because he didn't put out a bowl of milk?" Marcello didn't answer. He just walked past me, back toward the front door. I followed him outside, where the woman on the porch was still sobbing. She looked up as we approached, her eyes red and swollen. "I told him," she said, her voice shaking. "I told him not to forget. But he didn't listen. He said it was nonsense. And now he's gone." Marcello put a hand on her shoulder. "Go inside, Mrs. Abernathy," he said gently. "We'll take care of everything." She nodded and stumbled back into the house, closing the door behind her. I turned to Marcello, my mind racing. What the hell is going on in this town? He sighed and adjusted his hat. "I told you, Luke. Just follow the rules, and you'll be fine." With that, he walked away, leaving me standing there on the porch, wondering what kind of place I just got myself into. I've been in Blackburn Hollow for 3 days now, and something about this town is gnawing at me. It's not just the quiet streets or the way people go out of their way to avoid me. No, it's deeper than that. Like the place itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Take yesterday, for example. I was patrolling Main Street when I saw a little boy riding his bike near the old general store. It seemed normal enough at first, until his mother sprinted out of the store like her life depended on it. She grabbed him off the bike, so fast he barely had time to yelp. Without a word, she carried him inside, slammed the door shut, and pulled the blinds down. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, wondering what the hell that was about. But when I walked up to knock, I caught a glimpse of her peeking out from behind the curtain. The fear in her eyes stopped me cold. She shook her head, just once, then disappeared back into the house. I didn't knock. It was weird, sure, but that was just the beginning. Later that evening, as I was heading home, I saw Mrs. Thompson standing on her porch. She's a sweet old lady with a garden full of roses, the kind of person who always waves at you when you walk by. But tonight, she wasn't smiling. She wasn't even looking at me. She was pouring a bowl of milk onto the ground. "Evening, Mrs. Thompson," I called out, trying to sound casual. She didn't respond. She just kept pouring, her hand trembling like she was scared of spilling even a drop. When the bowl was empty, she placed it carefully on the porch, sat down in a rocking chair, and stared straight ahead. Her eyes were glassy, and tears were streaming down her face. "Are you all right?" I asked, stepping closer. Still nothing. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I couldn't explain why. It was like I just walked into a room where something terrible had happened, a feeling so thick you could almost taste it. I stood there for a minute, unsure what to do. Then, without warning, Mrs. Thompson whispered something. It was so soft, I almost didn't hear it. "Go home, Officer Harrison. It's almost dark." I opened my mouth to ask her what she meant, but before I could say a word, she got up, went inside, and locked the door behind her. I stood there on the porch, staring at the empty bowl and the puddle of milk soaking into the dirt. For a second, I thought about knocking, about demanding some answers, but something in the back of my mind told me to let it go. So I left. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the boy, his mother, and Mrs. Thompson. There was a pattern here. I could feel it, but I didn't have enough pieces to put it together yet. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft, whispering sound coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but when I sat up and listened closely, I realized it wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from the ground. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and walked to the window. The street was empty, but the whispering didn't stop. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't faint either. It was steady, like a voice just out of reach, speaking words I couldn't understand. I don't scare easily. I've been a cop for 10 years, and I've seen my fair share of bad things. But this felt different. I want to go outside, to follow the sound and figure out where it was coming from. But something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the memory of Mrs. Thompson's tear-streaked face, or maybe it was the look in that boy's mother's eyes when she pulled him inside. Whatever it was, it whispered the same warning over and over in my head. "Go home, Officer Harrison. It's almost dark." I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I went straight to the station and asked Sheriff Crowley about the milk, the kid, and Mrs. Thompson. He didn't even blink. "Don't worry about it," he said, leaning back in his chair. "People around here have their ways. Best thing you can do is leave them be." "But it's not normal," I said. "They're scared, Marcello. Something's got them terrified." He just smiled, that same cold, empty smile he always wears. "Like I said," he replied, "it's just the way things are in Blackburn Hollow. You'll get used to it." I want to push him, to demand answers, but I knew it wouldn't do any good. So I nodded, turned, and left his office. But I wasn't going to let it go. Not yet. Because whatever was happening in this town, it wasn't just the way things are. It was something darker, something dangerous. and I was going to find out what it was, no matter what it took. When I first heard about Agnes, I thought she was just another old-timer clinging to spooky stories. Every town has one, the kind of person who warns you about cursed crossroads or haunted bridges. But something about the way people talked about Agnes made her stand out. They didn't just call her eccentric. They said she knew things. Dark things. I figured it was worth a visit. If nothing else, I get to hear some colorful local folklore. Agnes lived at the far edge of town, where the paved roads turned to dirt and the trees pressed in close, like they were leaning in to eavesdrop. Her house was old and sagging, its paint faded to a ghostly gray. A rusted wind chime swayed from the porch, though there wasn't a breath of wind. I stepped onto the creaking porch and knocked. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet. At first, there was nothing. No movement, no sound from inside. I was about to knock again when the door cracked open just an inch, and a single pale eye peered out at me. "Who's there?" The voice was dry and thin, like old parchment. "Ma'am, my name's Luke Harrison. I'm with the Blackburn Hollow Police." I tried to sound friendly, but the words felt stiff in my mouth. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions. The eye studied me for a long moment, unblinking. Then, without a word, the door opened wider, and Agnes stepped back, motioning me inside. Her living room was like something out of a different era. Heavy, dark furniture crowded the space, and faded lace curtains hung limp over the windows. The air smelled of dust, dried herbs, and something faintly metallic like old blood. "Sit," she said, pointing to a threadbare armchair. I obeyed, feeling like a kid sent to the principal's office. Agnes lowered herself into a rocking chair across from me. Her hands were thin and knotted, like the roots of an ancient tree, and her face was a map of deep lines and hollows. But her eyes were sharp, too sharp for someone her age. "You shouldn't be here," she said, rocking slowly. The chair creaked with each motion. Blackburn Hollow doesn't take kindly to outsiders asking questions. "I've noticed," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "But I'm not just any outsider. I'm a cop. It's my job to ask questions." Her mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Questions can be dangerous around here, Officer Harrison. Sometimes it's better not to know." I leaned forward. "I don't have that luxury, ma'am. People are disappearing, dying, and no one wants to tell me why." Agnes sighed, a long, weary sound, and for a moment, I thought she was going to tell me to leave. But then she reached for a small tin box on the table beside her. Her fingers trembled as she opened it and took out a crumpled photograph. She handed it to me without a word. The photo was old, its edges frayed and yellowed with age. It showed a group of people standing in front of what looked like a stone altar deep in the woods. At first, it seemed like a normal picture, but the longer I looked, the more wrong it felt. The people weren't smiling. They weren't even looking at the camera. Their faces were blank, their eyes empty, as if they weren't really there. "What is this?" I asked, my voice low. Agnes didn't answer right away. She just stared at the photo, her expression grim. "That's the altar," she said finally. "The heart of the curse." I frowned. "Curse? What curse?" Agnes leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The curse that's kept Blackburn Hollow in darkness for over 100 years. The rules, the disappearances, it all goes back to the altar. It's where it began, and it's where it'll end." A chill ran down my spine. "And what happens at the altar?" Her eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I saw fear there. Real, bone-deep fear. "Sacrifices," she said. "That's how the curse stays alive. The town offers blood, and the woods give us protection, for a price." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. It sounded insane, like something out of a bad horror movie. But the way Agnes said it, so matter-of-factly, made my skin crawl. "Why hasn't anyone stopped it?" I asked. "Why not destroy the altar?" Agnes shook her head. "It's not that simple. The altar isn't just stone, it's a doorway. And if you break the seal, you let something worse out." Before I could ask what she meant, Agnes suddenly stiffened. Her eyes darted to the window, and her face went pale. "They're watching," she whispered. "You need to leave. Now." I glanced toward the window, but all I saw was the thick curtain of trees outside. Still, there was something in her voice that made me get to my feet. "Agnes, go," she hissed, her voice trembling. "And don't come back. You've already drawn too much attention." I hesitated for a moment, then nodded and headed for the door. As I stepped outside, I felt a sudden rush of cold air, like a breath on the back of my neck. I turned, but there was nothing there, just the empty woods, silent and still. I walked back to my car, the photo still clutched in my hand. As I started the engine and drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me from the shadows. And for the first time since I came to Blackburn Hollow, I felt truly afraid. The police station in Blackburn Hollow wasn't much to look at, just a squat, brick building with cracked windows and faded lettering on the door. Inside, it smelled like dust, stale coffee, and old paper. The kind of place where time slows down and settles like cobwebs in the corners. That day, I had the place to myself. Marcello was off somewhere, doing whatever it is he does when he isn't keeping his beady eyes on me. The deputies had cleared out early, too, which wasn't unusual. They liked to be home well before sundown. Can't say I blame them. I sat at my desk, flipping through a stack of old case files. Most of them were boring. Petty thefts, drunk and disorderlies, the occasional missing person report. But something about those missing person files fell off. They all ended the same way. Case closed. No further investigation warranted. No explanations. No details. Just a dead-end sentence that didn't sit right with me. That's when I found it. It was tucked between two thick, dusty binders, an old leather-bound journal with a cracked spine and yellowed pages. The name on the cover had faded, but inside, in spidery handwriting, were the words, Deputy Thomas Whitaker. Blackburn Hollow, 1986. I flipped to the first page, and my heart started pounding before I'd even read a word. There was something about the journal, something heavy, like it carried the weight of every dark secret in this town. I swallowed hard and started reading. March 3rd, 1986. It's been 6 months since I took the job here in Blackburn Hollow, and I can't shake the feeling that I made a terrible mistake. This town isn't right. There are rules, strange rules, and if you break them, things happen. People disappear. People die, and no one talks about it. I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just the words. It was the way they were written, hurried, shaky, like Whitaker had been scared out of his mind. I turned the page and kept reading. March 10th, 1986. They found Jimmy Monroe's body today, or what was left of it. He was only 12 years old. His parents are saying it was a bear attack, but I know better. Jimmy broke the rules. He stayed out after dark. I saw him that night, riding his bike down Main Street like it was no big deal. The next morning, he was gone. We found him in the woods, torn to pieces. Sheriff Crowley told us to close the case and keep our mouths shut. It's for the good of the town, he said. But how can this be good for anyone? I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. Another Crowley. Another sheriff with secrets to keep. I wonder if Marcello had ever mentioned Jimmy Monroe. I wonder how many other names have been buried in files I'd never seen. The next few entries were more of the same. Strange deaths, disappearances, whispers about the watchers in the woods. Whitaker was trying to piece it all together, but every time he got close to the truth, he hit a wall. April 15th, 1986. I found it. God help me, I found it. There's an altar deep in the woods, made of black stone. It's covered in carvings, symbols I don't recognize. I think it's where they make the sacrifices. I think it's where the curse started. I wanted to destroy it, but I couldn't get close. There's something guarding it, something that isn't human. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. I flipped ahead, skimming the pages. The handwriting grew messy, more frantic. Whitaker was unraveling, and I couldn't blame him. May 2nd, 1986. They know I've been asking questions. Sheriff Crowley told me to back off, but it's too late. I've seen too much. I think they're coming for me. If anyone finds this journal, please, for the love of God, get out of Blackburn Hollow. Don't make the same mistake I did. That was the last entry. After that, the pages were blank. I closed the journal and sat there in stunned silence. Whitaker had vanished almost 40 years ago, and no one had ever found out what happened to him. But now, I had a pretty good idea. He'd dug too deep, just like I was starting to, and it had cost him everything. I glanced out the window. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, and the long shadows of the trees stretched across Main Street like dark fingers. I should have gone home. I should have locked up the journal and pretended I'd never seen it. But I couldn't. I had no more. I grabbed my jacket, stuffed the journal under my arm, and headed for the door. If there really was an altar out there in the woods, I was going to find it. And God help me, I was going to destroy it. The air in Blackburn Hollow always had a heaviness to it, like the humidity you feel before a thunderstorm. But that day it felt worse. Maybe it was my imagination, or maybe the town knew what I was about to do. Either way, the dread sat in my chest like a stone as I walked to the police station. I needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to me. Sheriff Marcello Crowley. The station was nearly empty when I stepped inside. The old wooden floor creaked beneath my boots, and the faint smell of cigarette smoke lingered in the air. Marcello was at his desk, leaning back in his chair, flipping through some paperwork like it was any other day in a normal town. He didn't even look up when I walked in. "Sheriff," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He raised one eyebrow, but didn't stop reading. "Luke, something on your mind?" There was something about the way he said it, like he already knew why I was there. But I wasn't about to back down. I pulled the old, dusty journal from my jacket and tossed it onto his desk. It landed with a dull thud. That got his attention. He glanced at it, then slowly leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk. His eyes met mine, and for a second, I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff about to fall. "Where'd you find that?" His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, something cold. "In the back office. Buried under a pile of junk," I said. "I've been reading it. Seems like your little rule book isn't just about keeping people in line, is it?" He didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he leaned back again and folded his arms across his chest. "You shouldn't be poking around in things you don't understand," he said quietly. "Maybe, but I'm already in it now, Sheriff. So why don't you tell me the truth? What's really going on in this town? What's out there in the woods? And what the hell is the deal with all these rules?" Marcello sighed and rubbed a hand over his face. For the first time, he looked tired. Not just physically tired, but worn down like he'd been carrying a heavy weight for a long, long time. "You want the truth, Luke?" he said. "Fine, but you're not going to like it." He stood up and walked over to the window, staring out of the town. From where I was sitting, I could see the edge of the woods in the distance, dark and silent. "This place," Marcello said, "is older than you think. Older than the state. Older than the country. And it's cursed. Has been for a long time." I waited, not sure what to say. He kept talking, his voice low and grim. "Hundreds of years ago, back when this was nothing but wilderness, the first settlers made a deal. They were starving, dying of disease, desperate. And something in the woods heard them. It promised them food, safety, prosperity, in exchange for loyalty. And sacrifices." My throat went dry. "Sacrifices?" Marcello nodded. "Human ones. It started with the outsiders, travelers passing through, people no one would miss. But over time, the rules changed. The sacrifices had to be people who broke the rules, people who didn't obey." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. "And you're okay with that? You just go along with it?" His jaw tightened, and for the first time, I saw anger flash in his eyes. "You think I like this? You think I want to see people die? I was born into this, same as everyone else. My family's been running this town for generations. It's my job to keep the peace, to keep the rules in place. Because if we don't, the whole town goes down." I shook my head, trying to wrap my mind around what he was saying. "So what? You're telling me that if someone forgets to put out a bowl of milk, they get killed?" "It's not that simple," he said. "The rules keep the curse at bay. Break them, and the curse comes for you. It's not me doing it. It's them." He nodded toward the woods. I thought about the journal, about the descriptions of shadowy figures and strange lights in the forest, about the boy who disappeared after staying out past dark. "And the altar?" I asked. Marcello's face darkened. "You really have been reading, haven't you?" He turned away from the window and walked back to his desk, sitting down heavily. "The altar is where it all started," he said. "It's the heart of the curse. But it's also what keeps us alive. Destroy it, and the pact is broken. But you don't want to know what happens after that." I leaned forward. "What happens?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Something worse. Something older. It's been waiting under that altar for centuries. You break the pact, you let out." The room went silent. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and fast in my ears. "So what am I supposed to do?" I asked. "Just follow the rules and hope I don't screw up?" Marcello shrugged. "That's what the rest of us do." I stood up, my hands clenched in a fist. That's not good enough. There's got to be another way. Marcelo sighed again and looked up at me, his expression tired and sad. You're a good cop, Luke, but you're not going to fix this town. Not on your own. You either follow the rules or you don't. And if you don't, well, you've seen what happens. I stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked out of the station. Outside, the sky was starting to darken, and the woods loomed in the distance, dark and silent. I felt like they were watching me. Marcelo was right about one thing. I wasn't going to fix this town on my own, but I wasn't ready to give up, either. Not yet. I stood in the middle of Main Street, the weight of Blackburn Hollow pressing down on me like the thick fog that never seemed to lift. The town had a way of making you feel small, as though it existed long before you arrived, and would outlast you too. I could feel the rules everywhere, like 1,000 eyes watching, always just out of sight. They were suffocating me, and every day, it was getting harder to breathe. I couldn't stand it anymore. The strange disappearances, the quiet murmurs of the townsfolk, the looks they gave me when they thought I wasn't paying attention. I'd seen enough to know that something was deeply wrong with this place. But what could I do? No one was talking. No one except Sheriff Marcelo. And he was always one step ahead, like he knew exactly what I was thinking before I even thought it. I'd had enough of the rules. Enough of being told what I could and couldn't do. The people of this town were terrified of breaking those rules. And that terror was killing them, slowly. That's when I saw him. Nathan Pierce. He was a young man, just barely into his 20s. He'd been living in Blackburn Hollow his entire life, like everyone else. I'd seen him around, hanging out with the other locals. But today he was standing outside the diner, looking nervous, his eyes darting around like he expected someone to grab him at any moment. I had no idea what happened to him. At first, I thought it was just another townie who couldn't handle the pressure. But then I heard the whispers. He had stayed out past dark. A stupid mistake, but one that could cost him everything. Luke, the voice came from behind me. It was Deputy Harper. I could tell she was struggling with something. She'd been with the department longer than I had, and she wasn't the type to speak out of turn, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Did you hear about Nathan? She asked, looking over her shoulder like she expected someone to be watching. I nodded. Yeah. What happened? Her voice dropped to a whisper. He's gone, Luke. I mean, really gone. Not just disappeared. Vanished. Just like all the others. Gone where? She shook her head, biting her lip. I don't know. No one knows. But they say he broke the rule. He stayed out after dark. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I'd heard the stories, sure. People vanishing for breaking the rules, but no one ever really spoke about it. It was always just a whisper on the wind. Marcelo? I asked. Harper nodded gravely. He doesn't want you getting too close to this one, Luke. He told me to let it go, that there's nothing we can do. I felt the frustration rising in my chest, hot and sharp. Let it go. This kid's missing. Someone's got to do something. Her face hardened. You don't understand. It's not just about him anymore. It's about all of us. If we don't follow the rules, we'll all pay for it. Marcelo said there are things in the woods. Things that come out when we break the rules. I stared at her, unsure what to say. The fear in her eyes was real, genuine, and it made me question everything I'd seen so far. I don't care about Marcelo or his damn rules, I said, feeling the anger bubbling up. I'm not going to let another person just disappear. Harper's face paled, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned and walked away, her footsteps quick and light. I wasn't sure if she was afraid for me or for herself, but it didn't matter. I had to do this. I started walking toward the woods. Every step felt heavier, like the trees themselves were reaching out to stop me. The air grew colder the closer I got, thick with an unnatural stillness that felt wrong. The kind of wrong you can't shake, like it's pressing down on your chest, suffocating you. The deeper I went, the more it felt like something was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling, couldn't ignore the prickle on the back of my neck. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But there was something else, something lurking just beyond my sight. I kept walking, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The trees seemed to twist, their gnarled branches reaching out to block my path. But I kept going, driven by the need to find answers, to uncover what was really going on in this godforsaken town. I had to know. And then, there it was. The altar. Just like the journal had said. I wasn't sure how I knew it was the right place, but I felt in my gut. The air was thick here, charged with something ancient and dark. I stepped forward, my heart pounding, and then I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was Nathan. He was standing in front of the altar, his eyes wide open, but lifeless, like he was trapped in some kind of trance. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. And his skin was pale, almost translucent, like something was draining the life out of him. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. "Nathan!" I shouted, but he didn't move. It was like he couldn't hear me, or didn't want to. And then I heard the voice. A deep, guttural growl that sent a chill down my spine. "Leave this place, boy." I froze. The voice wasn't human. It was something older, something ancient. And I realized, with a sickening certainty, that I'd just stepped into something much worse than I could have ever imagined. The rules weren't just to protect us. They were there to protect them, the things that lurked in the woods. And now they knew I was here. I never thought I'd find myself out here, deep in the woods at night, surrounded by nothing but trees that felt like they were watching, waiting. It was as if the darkness itself had eyes. The air was thick, heavy with humidity, and every step I took seemed to be swallowed up by the shadows. My boots crunched on the wet leaves, but it felt like the ground was trying to pull me under, each step more reluctant than the last. I turned to look at the small group of people who had come with me. There were only 3 left now. Agnes, the frail old woman who'd warned me. Dean, the mechanic who had seen enough to know this town was cursed. And myself. The rest had disappeared or fled when they saw what kind of terror this place could really bring. "Keep close," I said, my voice sounding strangely small in the vastness of the woods. My words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before being swallowed by the silence that followed. Even the crickets had stopped chirping, and that unnatural quiet made my skin crawl. Dean held his flashlight out in front of him, his hand trembling just slightly. It didn't help. The beam barely cut through the dense trees, casting long, eerie shadows that danced and flickered as if they had lives of their own. My heart beat faster, and I had to force myself to keep moving. We had no idea where the altar was exactly, only that it was somewhere deep within this godforsaken forest. The journal I found had said something about a clearing, but no details. No map. Just vague descriptions about a place where the earth itself had been corrupted. The Watchers were there, and they wanted their tribute. "Luke, are you sure about this?" Agnes's voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking louder would get us noticed. "I don't have a choice," I replied, though I wasn't sure if that was true anymore. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was being led somewhere, pulled by some unseen force. It felt wrong, like the woods themselves were guiding me to a place I wasn't supposed to reach. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches twisting like gnarled hands, trying to trap us in their grip. Each gust of wind sent a shiver down my spine as it rustled through the leaves, making them sound like whispers in a language I couldn't understand. We walked for what felt like hours, the darkness thickening, until we came to a place that felt different. The air grew colder, and I could taste the bitter scent of something foul hanging in the breeze. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, some old tree stump or another piece of nature playing games with my mind. But as I stepped closer, I realized that it wasn't natural at all. It was an altar. Rough stones were stacked haphazardly, dark with age and covered in moss. Blood had stained some of the rocks, old and dried, but still visible in the dim light. I felt a chill crawl up my back, the hairs on my neck standing up. It was as though the air around me had thickened, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Agnes let out a sharp gasp, her frail hand trembling as she pointed at something in the center of the altar. A symbol, carved into the stone. It was an ancient design, twisted lines that seemed to pulse with an energy that I could feel deep in my bones. "What is it?" I asked, my voice cracking despite my best effort to remain calm. Agnes shook her head, her face pale under the beam of the flashlight. "It's them, the Watchers." Before I could say anything more, I heard the sound of twigs snapping behind us. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. I was expecting to see Dean or Agnes, but there was nothing, just darkness. That same silence pressed down on me, and for a second, I thought I might lose it. My mind was starting to break apart under the weight of everything. Then I saw it, a figure, just beyond the reach of the flashlight's glow. Tall, impossibly tall, standing in the shadows. I couldn't make out any features, just the outline of a form that didn't belong. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I took a step back, instinctively trying to reach for my gun, but my hand was shaking too badly to grasp it. "Luke, what is that?" Dean's voice was hoarse, his eyes wide with fear. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was paralyzed by the sight of it. The figure stepped forward, then another, and another. They emerged from the darkness like specters, silent and watching, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I counted 5, maybe more. I couldn't tell. They moved closer, not walking, but gliding over the ground, as if they were floating. I turned back to the altar, my breath catching in my throat. The symbol on the stone seemed to pulse, as though it were alive. The Watchers were here. They had come. Dean shouted something, but I couldn't hear him over the sound of my own heart beating, so loud it felt like it might burst from my chest. The Watchers were closing in, and I knew, with a sick certainty, that we weren't meant to leave this place. Then, I heard Marcello's voice. It was low and calm, like he had been waiting for us all along. "You shouldn't have come, Luke. None of you should have come." I turned, my heart sinking into my stomach. Sheriff Marcello stood at the edge of the clearing, his cold eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "I warned you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you didn't listen. And now, you'll have to pay the price." And in that moment, I realized how deep the game went. The rules, the town, everything, it was all a lie. And now, it was too late to turn back. The Watchers had their tribute, and we were it. The trees creaked, the wind howled, and the darkness pressed in closer. The woods were alive, and we were its prey. The air was thick with a kind of dread as I reached the altar. Every step felt heavier than the last, the ground beneath me turning soft, almost as if the earth itself was trying to swallow me whole. The woods around me had grown unnaturally silent, save for the faint hum of something just beyond hearing, like a warning. I had lost everyone. Each of them had fallen away, one by one. Some screamed before they disappeared into the shadows. Others had just vanished. And now it was just me, alone in the woods with the weight of everything pressing down on me. I could feel it, the pull of something old, something evil. It seemed to call to me from the altar, a jagged stone structure half buried under a layer of moss. It looked ancient, like it had been here for centuries, longer than the town itself. The stone was cold to the touch when I placed my hand on it. My skin crawled. A rustling behind me snapped me out of my thoughts. "Thought you'd make it this far." The voice was low, menacing. Sheriff Marcello stepped into view, his tall, gaunt figure emerging from the trees, almost blending into the darkness like he was part of it. His eyes gleamed, watching me with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. "You've come all this way, Luke. You've seen it, haven't you?" Marcello's voice was calm, too calm. There was no fear in him, no hesitation, just that same cold certainty. He stepped closer, the moonlight casting long shadows across his face. "You've learned the truth." I didn't speak. I couldn't. I just stared at him, the weight of everything crashing down on me. The rules, the deaths, the disappearances, the pact. It all made sense now, too much sense. "You think you're special," Marcello continued, his lips curling into something between a smile and a sneer. "But you're not. You're just another pawn, another piece in the game. We've all played our part." I shook my head, anger rising in me, but it was drowned out by the overwhelming sense of power that surrounded the altar. It was as if the ground beneath my feet was alive, breathing. The air felt thicker here, heavy with an ancient presence, something that had been waiting for a long time. "You don't understand," Marcello said, his voice turning colder. "If you break the altar, if you destroy it, the curse will be broken, yes. But you'll free something far worse. This town, everything here, everything that's ever been, is tied to this. The Watchers. You're not just breaking a rule. You'll unleash it all." His words hit me like a slap. I had been so sure, so certain that destroying the altar would end it, that it would stop the curse, stop the sacrifices, stop the endless cycle of death. But Marcello's eyes bored into mine, his gaze unwavering, and I realized I had no idea what I was dealing with. I took a step back. My heart thudded in my chest as the weight of my decision pressed against me. Marcello was right. The curse was tied to this place, to the very air, the very ground. What would happen if I tore it all down? What will we unleash? What if it was worse than the sacrifice? What if we weren't meant to break it at all? You have to make a choice, Luke, Marcello said, his voice low and almost pitying. Do you destroy the altar and risk everything? Or do you leave it be and let the cycle continue? The rules, the deaths, the sacrifices, nothing changes unless you choose. And I can't help you with this. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. I could feel the pressure building in my chest, the fear clawing at my throat. My mind raced, running through everything I had learned, all the stories, all the signs. Was it worth it? Could I destroy the altar, knowing what could come from it? Or should I walk away, let the town keep its cursed balance, its strange rules that had held it together for so long? Marcello stepped closer, his hand brushing the stone altar. They are waiting, Luke. And I'm not sure you're ready for what comes next. His voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn and run, to leave Blackburn Hollow behind and never look back. But I couldn't. Not after everything. Not after everything I'd seen. I reached for the stone. The moment my fingers touched it again, the ground beneath me seemed to tremble. The darkness around us deepened, as if something in the woods had awakened. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if I could even stop it, if I was already too late. But one thing was certain. I was the only one left standing, and this was my choice. The weight of the decision crushed me. There was no going back now. I stood there, in the heart of the woods, staring at the altar in front of me. The stone slabs, worn by centuries of use, seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if they were alive. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something darker, something that I couldn't quite place, but it felt ancient, suffocating. The shadows around me seemed to move, and I realized that the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. Marcello stood across from me, his eyes locked onto mine with a cold, calculating gaze. His face was unreadable, but his presence was overwhelming, like he was the true ruler of this cursed place. You don't have much time. Marcello's voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of something that made my skin crawl. This is it, Luke. The choice you've been avoiding. I took a deep breath, my chest tight, trying to steady myself. I had come here seeking answers, hoping to find some kind of resolution, some way to break free from this town and its twisted rules. But now, standing before the altar, the weight of everything hit me all at once. There were no easy answers. There were no simple choices. Destroy the altar, and the curse would break. That much was clear. But Marcello had warned me what would happen next. The evil that had been bound here for generations would be released, unleashed into the world. There was no telling what horrors that would bring. On the other hand, if I did nothing, if I let this place continue to feed off the lives of its residents, let the cycle of sacrifice go on, I might save the town, but at what cost? I would be complicit in this madness, bound to the same fate as everyone else who had lived here. A prisoner, in my own way. I glanced down at the altar, its dark stone surface smooth and worn, a place of both ritual and suffering. It had been here for centuries, feeding on the fear and blood of those who dared to defy the rules of Blackburn Hollow. The town had survived because of it, thriving in ways I could never fully understand. And yet, it had always been a prison, a place where the innocent and the guilty alike were drawn into the same cycle. Marcello, I said, my voice thick, fighting to remain steady. You don't have to keep this going. You know it's wrong. Marcello's lips curled into a tight, almost pitying smile. Wrong? Luke, you're missing the point. This is the only way. The rules, the sacrifices, they keep the balance. The Watchers demand it. They've always demanded it. Without this altar, without the bloodshed, the town will fall. And so will we all. I wanted to scream at him, to shout that this was madness, that there had to be another way. But something deep inside me knew the truth. This town had always lived on borrowed time. The rules, the rituals, they weren't just traditions. They were survival. I turned back to the altar, the weight of the decision settling into my bones. My hand hovered over the stone surface, the chill of it seeping into my fingertips. The thought of destroying it felt like ripping apart something deep inside me, like tearing at the very fabric of everything I'd come to understand about this place. But as I looked into Marcello's eyes, I saw something else, a glint of something darker, a recognition that he, too, knew the truth. He had been here long enough to see the cost of this cursed existence, and yet he had chosen to embrace it. I couldn't do it. I couldn't let this place continue, feeding off the lives of its people, no matter the consequences. I had to stop it, even if it meant unleashing the nightmare that had been locked away for so long. I turned back to Marcello, my voice low but firm. I can't let this continue. I won't. Marcello didn't say a word. His eyes narrowed, and I saw the flicker of something dangerous behind them. He stepped forward, his hand reaching for something at his side. For a moment, I thought he might attack, but instead he pulled out a small, dark object, an old, twisted symbol, the same one I had seen in the journal. The symbol of the Watchers. "This isn't just your decision anymore, Luke," Marcello said, his voice a whisper. "It's theirs." Before I could react, the ground beneath my feet trembled, and the air grew heavy. A low, guttural sound filled the woods, rising from the depths of the earth. The trees around us shook, their branches swaying as if they, too, were alive. The shadows seemed to stretch, pulling toward the altar like hungry fingers reaching for a meal. I could feel it, the evil stirring, awakening. Marcello didn't flinch. He stood there, like he was waiting for something. The altar behind me began to glow faintly, the stones shifting, as though something was coming through. I had no choice. I stepped forward, my hand shaking as I touched the stone of the altar. It was cold, but not just cold. It was alive, thrumming with an energy that was almost unbearable. The air crackled with power, and I felt it deep in my bones. The curse was real, and it had a grip on everything in this town. "I'm sorry," I whispered, more to myself than to Marcello. Then, with a single motion, I struck the stone. The world seemed to shudder. The altar cracked, a sharp, bone-deep sound that reverberated through the forest. The earth trembled, and the skies above darkened, as if the heavens themselves were rejecting what I had done. For a moment, everything went silent, and I held my breath, waiting for the consequences. And then, the darkness came. From the crack in the altar, an unnatural wind rushed out, carrying with it a sound like the wailing of thousands of souls. I felt the cold fingers of something ancient and malicious brush against my skin, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I had made a terrible mistake. The Watchers had been freed. The trees around us groaned, their branches twisting like twisted limbs reaching for the sky. The ground split open, and shadows began to pour from the earth, swirling around me. I could feel it. This was no longer just about the town. It was about something far worse, something far older than anything I had ever imagined. And as the darkness closed in around me, I realized there was no going back. The curse had been broken, but something far worse had been set free. I stood at the edge of the woods, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, watching the dark trees stretch above me, their branches twisting like gnarled hands reaching for the sky. The fog had thickened, creeping in from the edges of the forest, curling around the trunks like it was alive. It was as if the woods themselves were breathing, waiting for something or someone. The air felt heavier now, thick with an unspoken tension, and my chest ached from the weight of what I had just done. The choice I had made, the altar, the curse, the evil that would now be unleashed, roaming free from the shackles it had been bound in for centuries. It all rushed back in a rush of dizzying clarity. Marcello's voice in the shadows, his cold eyes telling me the truth, that breaking the altar wouldn't just break the curse, but it would also release something much worse. A force so ancient and terrible that the town had lived in fear of it for generations. And yet, it was me who had set it free. I shuddered, staring at the dark trees in front of me. Was this what the town wanted? Did they know? Or were they too terrified to stop it? The whole damn town had been a trap. My arrival, my purpose. Everything had led to this moment. The faint sound of footsteps behind me jerked me out of my thoughts. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. I could feel him, Marcello, the sheriff, the man who had orchestrated this whole damn nightmare. "I see you're still here," Marcello said, his voice low, almost regretful, but there was a hint of something else behind it. Something cold and final. I didn't turn to face him. I just stood there, feeling the fog roll in, its chill creeping under my jacket. It felt like the land itself was closing in, trapping me. I should have left. I should have run the moment I'd had the chance. But something had kept me here. Something I couldn't shake. I thought you'd gone, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I thought you were going to let me be, Marcello. There is no leaving, Luke. His words were so final, so matter-of-fact. Not for you. Not for anyone who comes to Blackbur Hollow. You don't understand what you've done. You think you've stopped it, but you've only opened the door. I swallowed hard. What the hell are you talking about? He stepped closer, his boots crunching softly on the wet ground. I could feel him now, just behind me. The curse isn't the problem. It's what the curse kept buried beneath it. What we've kept buried. I turned slowly, my stomach twisting. And now it's free? Marcello smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was cold, empty. It's always been free. We just had to make sure it stayed hidden. You couldn't see it, Luke, but it was watching you all along, waiting. The weight of his words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. My heart began to race. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen, like the very land beneath my feet had taken hold of me. I did what you wanted, I said, my voice trembling. I followed your rules. I destroyed the altar. I freed the town. Marcello shook his head slowly, his eyes darkening. You freed nothing. You've just become part of it, part of the system, just like everyone before you. The Watchers in the woods never wanted to be free, Luke. They wanted a protector, a keeper. My breath caught in my throat. What do you mean? You've known all along? All this time it was you. He nodded. Every sheriff before me. Every crow. We keep the balance, Luke. We keep the rules in place, or we pay the price. I felt the earth beneath me shift. The woods seemed to close in tighter, the shadows darker, thicker. A low growl rumbled in the distance, and the hairs on my neck stood on end. Something was out there. Something terrible. Oh, you're not even human anymore, are you? I whispered, the realization slamming into me like a freight train. Marcello's smile grew wider, almost cruel. I'm what this town needs me to be. What we all need to be. And now, so are you. My chest tightened, and the dread in my gut turned to panic. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, cracked. It was all too much. You'll see, Luke, Marcello said, his voice dropping to a whisper now, as the sound of footsteps echoed behind him, slow and deliberate. You'll see it soon enough. It's already beginning. I turned, my body instinctively moving toward the woods, my mind fighting against the terror rising in me. But then I saw it. The shadows moved, fluid and quick, darting between the trees. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were things, large, inhuman, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. A low, eerie hum filled the air, like the town itself was alive, feeding on the fear that had been sown for generations. Marcello's laugh echoed behind me as I took a step forward, but I knew it was too late. The town had claimed me, just like it claimed everyone who stepped foot inside its cursed borders. I had no choice now but to follow the rules, or else. As the first creature stepped into the clearing, its glowing eyes locking onto mine, I knew this was the end of me. And yet, a strange, numb calm settled over me. Blackburn Hollow had won. The Watchers had won. And I was just another cog in its endless machine, bound forever to its dark and twisted fate.